Sarah learned the weight of chains before she even understood the concept of freedom. At 15, in a community where a woman's loud laugh was viewed as an act of rebellion and desire as a cardinal sin, she was given away. There was no choice, just a white dress that felt more like a shroud, and a husband she barely knew. At 16, the weight shifted. It became a baby in her arms, Julia. Looking into those small, curious eyes, Sarah felt something new ignite. Ferocity. A silent promise carved right into her bones. The cycle ends here. It took years of failed attempts, escapes planned in the dead of night, thwarted by her age, by the high walls of surveillance, by the fear injected into her soul. But the seed of freedom had taken root. At 21, the door finally gave way. She ran. She ran with Julia pressed tight against her chest, the night wind sweeping the scent of incense and repression from her hair. She never looked back. Years later, the news of her widowhood arrived not as grief, but as the snap of a final shackle breaking. Sara was officially free. But freedom can be terrifying. She built high walls around her heart. No boyfriends, no flirting, no weekend flings. Her life became a straight, ascetic line dedicated exclusively to Julia. Sara worked double shifts, saved every penny, giving her daughter the education, the travel, and the colors that had been stolen from her own youth. She lived through Julia. The script only flipped on the night of her 40th birthday. Julia, now 24, was about to graduate from medical school. Sarah's great mission felt accomplished. That night, feeling strangely light, she got in her car and drove to the neighboring city. She did this sometimes. Ever since Julia moved away for college, Sara allowed herself these outings. But she needed anonymity. Even though she'd lived away from that closed community for decades, she still felt judged and watched by anyone she knew. Colleagues, neighbors, anyone. She never felt like herself around familiar faces. On the rare occasions she decided to have fun, Sara drove to the nearest tourist hub. Bigger, busier, perfect. She looked for sophisticated spots where she could dress up, feel beautiful, and simultaneously invisible. Just another woman. A place where no one would remember her name in the morning. The plan was mediocre and safe. Check into a nice hotel, have 2 expensive drinks at the bar, feel the alcohol warm her blood, go upstairs, sleep alone in Egyptian cotton sheets, and return to her routine the next day. Nothing wild, just a night to breathe. But Sarah's plans didn't account for the chaos factor, and chaos that night had a name, a magnetic presence, and a signature scent. The bar was dimly lit, the murmur of conversation creating a comfortable white noise. Sara was at the counter, swirling the ice in her glass, when she felt it. First, the scent. Vanilla. Not sweet and cloying, but something warm, sophisticated, with woody undertones that seemed to embrace the room. She looked up and saw her. A brunette. Elegant in a way that seemed to require zero effort. She had deep, almond-shaped eyes that looked like they held stories Sara would love to read. Women had always been interesting to Sara, a curiosity suffocated under layers of religious guilt, a forbidden whisper she learned to ignore. But this woman wasn't just interesting, she was a gravitational event. The rest of the bar seemed to blur out of focus. The brunette felt the gaze and turned. And then it happened. It was 3 seconds. 3 seconds where she held Sara's stare without flinching, without judgment, just intense curiosity and a silent invitation. In that instant, 40 years of repression trembled at the foundation. The "you can't" of her childhood collided violently with the "I want" of her present. No one knows for sure who made the first move. Maybe it was the brunette's crooked smirk, maybe Sara's nervous wave, but minutes later they were sharing a table in the corner. The conversation flowed as if they'd known each other for lifetimes. They laughed about the absurdity of pineapple in cocktails, debated the weather forecast like it was philosophy, talked about books, about the exhaustion of adulting. Eleanor, that was her name. With every word, Sara leaned in a little closer. The air around them crackled. The sexual tension was so palpable, it almost had a flavor. It was the mutual, urgent desire to stop talking and start feeling. It was fast. It was intense. It was, in a word, overwhelming. They went up to Sara's hotel room. There was none of the awkwardness of strangers. There was only an ancient hunger. They kissed at the door, dropping keys, tripping over shoes. In that bed, Sara wasn't the devoted mother, nor the survivor of a cult. She was just skin, desire, and the intoxicating scent of Eleanor's vanilla. The next morning held a different light. They woke up tangled together, the sun invading the hotel window. Breakfast in bed tasted like intimacy, like conspiratorial laughter. They exchanged numbers with veiled promises of, "I want more," and "When will I see you again?" Sara drove back home feeling radiant, alive, as if she had finally woken up from a long coma. But reality has a nasty habit of collecting its debt. That evening, the bubble burst. Julia arrived to spend the 2 weeks before graduation at home. Dinner was cozy, mother and daughter warmed by the fireplace, catching up. Sara looked at her daughter and felt she couldn't breathe without her existence. Julia was her world. "Mom, you have to see the class photos. The shoot turned out amazing," Julia said, grabbing her phone. Sara smiled, bursting with pride, as Julia swiped through the photos. And then the image froze on the screen. The lack of air became literal. Sara's world tilted on its axis. There was Julia, smiling in the center of the photo, surrounded by new doctors. And right next to her, with a paternal hand on Julia's shoulder, was the class's honored faculty mentor. The imposing woman, the brunette with almond eyes, Eleanor, the owner of the vanilla scent that was still lingering on Sara's skin, the woman with whom she'd moaned and laughed the night before. They say a human can survive a minute without breathing before collapsing. Sara lasted 3 seconds. Panic rose in her throat like bile. A violent coughing fit took over her body, terror blooming in her eyes as she tried to disguise the shock. Fate had a sadistic, cruel sense of humor. She didn't say anything. How could she? "Sweetie, you know your academic mentor? We slept together last night." Unthinkable. Sara tried to act naturally, but her body was on high alert. Julia, innocent to it all, began listing praises for her mentor. "Eleanor is incredible, Mom. We only really connected in the last year, and seriously, she's the smartest woman I know. Strict, but fair. She hates photos, just like you. These were a miracle. As the honoree, she couldn't refuse. We became friends this last year. You're gonna love her." Every adjective was a stab in Sara's chest. Incredible, smart, her daughter's friend. The final blow came with the invitation. "She lives in the next town over. We tried to get on the same flight, but I could only get a ticket for today, and she already had reservations, got here a couple of days ago. So I invited her for dinner here, day after tomorrow. It'll be the perfect chance for you two to meet." Sara felt the floor disappear. Dinner? Here? In her sanctuary? The next 2 nights were an exercise in psychological torture. Sara didn't sleep. Panic was a noisy guest in her mind. She replayed the night at the hotel, every touch, every whispered word, now tainted by guilt and terror. "It was just one night," she repeated to herself, staring at the dark ceiling. "It meant nothing. A mistake, but there's time to retreat. Time to build the wall again, higher this time." She couldn't be the mother who transgresses, the mother who complicates her daughter's life, the wrong mother. The voices of her religious past whispered that she was being punished for her sinful desire, but she didn't believe that anymore. The problem wasn't the alleged sin, it was society. It was professional reputation. It was boundaries. Sara made a decision born of desperation. She would feign amnesia. She would treat the woman who made her eyes roll back the night before as a complete and total stranger. Indifference would be her shield. The day of the dinner arrived. Sara cooked as if her life depended on it, chopping vegetables with manic precision to keep from thinking. The doorbell rang. Julia answered. "Eleanor, so glad you came. Mom, come meet Eleanor." Sara walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart hammering in her throat. When Eleanor crossed the threshold and saw Sara standing there in the living room, the shock on her face was visible. Her almond eyes went wide, her lips parted slightly. She looked ready to say, "Sara?" But before she could get a word out, "Good evening. A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Sara." 2 minutes later, Julia went upstairs to grab a special bottle of wine. Eleanor seized the opening. She followed Sara into the kitchen. The atmosphere shifted. Sexual tension and resentment collided. "Sara," Eleanor whispered, her voice urgent, stepping closer. "What is going on? Why are you acting like—" "No," Sara cut in sharply, her voice trembling. She held up a hand, stopping Eleanor in her tracks. "Don't you dare!" "Sara, we had an incredible connection. You can't just—" "I can and I will," Sara hissed. "Listen to me closely, Eleanor. Nothing, absolutely nothing, is more important to me than my daughter, and I am not willing to embarrass her with this." The word hung heavy in the kitchen air. Embarrass. It hit Eleanor like a physical slap. She took a step back, her almond eyes filling with deep hurt. There was no anger in her reaction, only a silent disappointment that hurt Sam more than any scream could have. "Understood," Eleanor said, her voice cold and contained. "Don't worry, I know my place." She turned and went back to the living room before Julia came down the stairs. The dinner was a theater of the absurd. The politeness was so forced it felt brittle. The silence between bites was too long, too heavy. Julia, always perceptive, noticed the glitches in the matrix. Her eyes darted from her mother, tense like a violin string, to her mentor, who seemed to be walking on eggshells. Something didn't fit. When Eleanor left, with a quick formal hug for Julia and a nod to Sara, the relief was immediate, followed by a crushing wave of sadness. "Mom, didn't you like her?" Julia asked as they cleared the plates. "I did, of course. She's very polite," Sara lied, avoiding her daughter's gaze. "I just have a terrible migraine today, honey. Sorry if I seemed off." Julia didn't buy the excuse. She knew her mother's migraines, and this was something else. But she filed the doubt away, for now. In the days that followed, the future doctor transformed into a detective. There were loose pieces in this puzzle. The tension at dinner wasn't the awkwardness of strangers. It was the tension of something she needed to uncover. Julia tested the waters. She tried to set up a coffee date just with Eleanor. Her friend's reply via text was strange, defensive. "Is your mother going?" Only after Julia guaranteed it would be just the two of them did Eleanor accept. Why would Eleanor worry about someone else's presence if they'd had dozens of afternoons like this? They weren't just mentor and student, they were friends. Julia needed a stress test. At the last minute, she convinced her mom to go out to relax, and coincidentally, they ended up at the same bar, the one where it all started, and by chance ran into Eleanor there. The truth, Julia invited her mom only after knowing Eleanor was already there. Julia set the trap without either of them knowing, just so she could observe them in the same habitat again. The three of them at the bar counter. The vibe was perfect for relaxing, yet Sara and Eleanor looked like they were on trial. They acted better than Hollywood veterans, trading cold pleasantries about the weather, about graduation, never looking each other in the eye for more than 2 seconds. To Julia, watching like a hawk, that excess of normalcy was the biggest symptom. The math wasn't mathing. Julia knew both women well. That wasn't how two women like them would behave unless something else was at play. There was a white elephant sitting at that bar, and it smelled like secrets and, curiously, vanilla. Then came graduation, the night that was supposed to be perfect. The ballroom was stunning, the music loud, the laughter easy. Julia was radiant in her gown, but part of her attention was constantly tracking the two most important women in her life. Sara and Eleanor were in the same room, but acted like identical poles of a magnet, actively repelling each other. If Sara went to the buffet, Eleanor went to the dance floor. If Eleanor went to the restroom, Sara went to the terrace. It was exhausting to watch. Julia watched from afar, between toasts with colleagues, feeling her frustration grow, until the dam broke. She saw it. In a secluded corner of the hall, near an emergency exit, the politeness finally cracked. Eleanor grabbed Sara by the arm. The gesture wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. Sara tried to pull away, but Eleanor wouldn't let go. They looked around discreetly, minimal movements, no one noticed, no one except Julia, who was locked in. Eleanor led Sara out the emergency door. They went to an area away from the guests. Julia followed discreetly. From a distance, hidden around a corner behind a wall, Julia watched as Eleanor and Sara began to argue in a dark corridor. Julia couldn't hear the words over the muffled music and distance, but the body language was screaming. The tension was electric. Eleanor, usually so controlled, was gesturing, her face twisted with frustration. Sara was defensive, shrinking into herself, shaking her head no. And then Eleanor pinned Sara against the wall. They were face to face, inches apart, gazes locked. There was anger, yes, there was hurt, but there was something else, something devouring and undeniable burning between them. Desire, pure and dammed up. It was Sara who broke. Maybe she couldn't fight her own nature anymore. She grabbed Eleanor's face with both hands and pulled her in. The kiss wasn't romantic. It was a collision, a desperate release right there in the dark corner of the party. It was a kiss of hunger, of anger, of longing for what could have been. Eleanor responded with the same intensity, hands going to Sara's waist, pulling her closer as if she wanted to fuse them together. The kiss lasted long enough to take the breath away from anyone watching. And then Sara's panic returned with full force. She shoved Eleanor away violently. Both were panting, lips swollen, eyes wide. Sara brought her hands to her head, stunned by what she had just done. Again. Terror flooded her. Without a word, Sara turned and fled. She ran down the deserted corridor toward the door that led to the street, as if she were being chased by every demon of her past. Eleanor stood alone in the corner. She looked at the empty space where Sara had been, and then, with a muffled scream of pure frustration, punched the wall. Julia saw everything. The kiss explained the what. The mystery was solved. But the why? That she needed to hear from her mother. Julia's heart ached. She walked decisively to the parking lot. She found Sara inside the car, in the driver's seat. The dashboard lights illuminated a face undone by tears. Sara was shaking uncontrollably, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was a life raft in a shipwreck. Julia opened the passenger door. The sound of the party drifted in, muffled. "Julia," Sara sobbed upon seeing her daughter, trying uselessly to wipe her face. "Honey, what are you doing here? I just came to get some air. I'm going back to the party." "Mom, I saw everything." Her voice was calm, clinical. Panic settled into Sara's eyes. "Honey, I can explain. I'm so sorry. I never wanted you to see. Mom, calm down, please. Get out of the car. Let's talk. Honey, please, let's just go. I don't want to stay here. Get out of the car, Mom. Running has never solved anything in your life. You know that. Sara obeyed, feeling minuscule, reverting to that voiceless 15-year-old girl. They stood in the cold parking lot. Explain it to me, Mom, please, from the beginning. Sara explained, with sincerity. The night of her 40th birthday, the bar, the drinks, the unforgettable night, the world crashing down the next day. Why, Mom? Julia asked, her voice thick with emotion now. Why are you running from the woman you clearly love? Sara exploded. Years of repression leaked into her words. Because I couldn't do that to you, Julia. Tonight is your night. She's your mentor, a respected woman, an academic. And me? I'm just the mom who barely finished school, the fugitive from the cult. What would people say? What would your colleagues think? She grabbed her daughter's shoulders, desperate to be understood. I spent my whole life trying to give you the best, trying to be perfect, to protect you from any stain. I didn't want to embarrass you. I would rather die than be the source of your shame. The confession hung in the cold night air. Embarrass. Julia looked at her mother. She saw the worry lines, the eyes red from crying, the posture of someone expecting a blow. And she saw the immense love, however distorted by trauma, that motivated it all. Embarrass? Julia held Sara's freezing hands firmly. Define shame, Mom, please. Sara heard what Julia said but seemed confused. She tried to pick the right words, but nothing seemed sufficient. She looked away. Julia, Sara's voice trembled. You used the word embarrass, as if loving someone is a reason for shame, as if you, after everything you went through, don't deserve to be happy, Mom. You ran from hell to save me. You worked 2 jobs, deleted your love life, sacrificed your entire self for me. I am the most grateful person in the world to be your daughter. Julia took a deep breath, ensuring each word landed. The only thing that would embarrass me, Mom, honestly, would be seeing you throw your chance at happiness because you're afraid of what a bunch of people who don't matter might think. You are not ruining my future. Since day one, everything you taught me was about having the right to choose, about the power of being free. And I learned, Mom. I followed your teachings. But what are you teaching me now? Tell me. Sara looked at her daughter, stunned. She expected judgment, anger. Instead, she got a sermon. For a few seconds, Sara remained reflective, silent, tears ready to fall. She looked at her daughter, the little girl who gave her strength to fight, and she saw not a defenseless child, but the strong, wise woman she herself had helped cultivate. But it's Eleanor, Sara whispered, still in disbelief. Exactly. Eleanor, the most demanding, brilliant, and hard-to-impress woman I know. And you know what? She chose you. Julia smiled, a complicit, adult smile. Do you have any idea how proud that makes me? And how I am not even a little bit surprised? You are amazing, Mom. It's obvious you two would be great together. Sara started crying again. But this time it was different. It was the weeping of relief, of decades of weight being lifted from her shoulders. I pushed her away. I said horrible things to her in the kitchen that day. I said horrible things today. She must hate me. Julia pulled a prescription pad she'd gotten as a graduation gift and a pen from her pocket. As your doctor, this is my first official prescription. She wrote quickly, tore off the sheet, and placed it in her mother's trembling hand. Sara read the paper under the yellow light of the street lamp. Diagnosis: chronic stubbornness and excess fear. Treatment? You know, Mom. You've always known. Sara read it and let a smile escape. I need to talk to her. Right now. Sara looked scared, but excited too. She wiped her tears from her face, checked her eyes in the vanity mirror. "She's in the back garden. I saw her heading there." Julia smiled. "Go, Mom, and don't you dare come home tonight." Sara looked at her daughter, laughed through her tears, kissed her forehead hard, and ran. She ran toward the garden, toward Eleanor, toward her own life. The reunion in the garden didn't need many words. Eleanor was sitting on a stone bench, staring at nothing. When she heard footsteps and saw Sara, she stood up, defensive, ready for another rejection. "What is it? Here to reject me again? I get it, Sara. You don't need to worry." But Sara didn't stop. She collided with Eleanor in a desperate embrace. "I'm sorry," Sara sobbed against her neck, breathing in that vanilla scent that was home. "Are you sure?" Eleanor hesitated for a second, but the stiffness left her body. She wrapped her arms around Sara, holding her tight. "I don't want to have you for 10 wonderful seconds and watch you run from me right after, Sara. I don't want false hope." "I'm not leaving, Eleanor. Never again. Please forgive me for being such a coward, but I want you. I want you so much. I want to be happy and love you the way you and I deserve." They kissed right there in the garden, under the moonlight. It wasn't a goodbye kiss or an angry one. It was an arrival, a kiss of someone who had finally stopped running.
6 months later. Life had settled into a delicious new rhythm. Sara and Eleanor were together, living that teenage romance neither had experienced at the right age, mixed with the maturity of 2 independent women. Julia went to dinner at her mom's house. The vibe was light: laughter, red wine, and Sara's comfort food. During dessert, Sara, a little tipsy from the wine, looked at her daughter with affection. "You know, Ju, I'm still impressed by how fast you connected the dots on graduation night. The kiss in the hall confirmed everything, sure, but before that, I thought we were being so discreet at the bar, at dinner." Eleanor, pouring more wine, agreed, laughing. "It's true, I am the queen of academic discretion, and your mother, well, your mother feigned indifference worthy of an Oscar at that horrible dinner." Julia swirled the wine glass in her hand, a victorious detective smile on her face. She looked from one to the other. "You guys are great actresses, I admit. The graduation drama was the final act, but you committed a fatal continuity error way before that. Or, rather, a costume error." "What are you talking about?" Sara furrowed her brow, confused. "Mom, remember the night I arrived and we talked in front of the fireplace?" "I remember." "Your purse was on the kitchen counter, and tied to the strap, maybe in a rush, leaving the hotel in the dark, was a scarf." Eleanor froze with the wine bottle in midair. "A moss-green silk scarf," Julia continued, savoring the moment, "with hand-stitched gold embroidery. Beautiful. I even touched it, thought it was different from your usual stuff." Sara brought her hand to her mouth, eyes wide. She looked at Eleanor. Julia turned to her former mentor. 3 weeks prior, you wore an identical scarf to the last class before break. A classmate complimented it, and you said it was a gift from your grandmother, handmade, one of a kind." Eleanor closed her eyes, starting to laugh nervously. A comedic silence fell over the table, broken only by Julia's triumphant laughter. "It took me a while to get it. At first, I thought they were just similar scarves, but your attitude made everything very suspicious. After the kiss, I was sure." Sara looked at Eleanor, incredulous and embarrassed. "I took your scarf? My God, Eleanor, I must have grabbed it with my clothes in the rush to check out. I turned my entire house upside down looking for that thing." Eleanor covered her face with her hands, cackling. "I thought I dropped it in the street. I put it in my sock drawer, thought I'd bought it ages ago and forgot. I don't know. I was so nervous those days. Sara defended herself, laughing too, her face beet red. Julia raised her glass in a toast. The perfect crime doesn't exist, ladies, especially when your daughter was trained to observe minute clinical details. Eleanor, still laughing, held Sara's hand across the table and looked at her student with genuine admiration. A+ in diagnosis, Dr. Julia. Sara smiled, her heart overflowing. She looked at the woman she loved and the daughter who was her pride. There were no more secrets, no more fears, and definitely no shame. There were just 3 adult women, happy, a moss-green scarf finally returned to its owner, and the soft, constant scent of vanilla in the air.